Okay, I'm gonna time you 10 minutes. Give you like a 2-minute warning, okay?
All right. All right, well, we'll just go. Okay, so it's actually great that you're going to give me feedback today because the research that Jason and I did was about receiving feedback and what that looks like in a studio setting. So I know most of us have in the past or are now in a studio at some point. So here's our little participation thing. If you will go to pollev.com, Esther McKell, no A on the end, they just dropped it off. And there is a question that I would like to answer, and we'll look at the results sort of at the end. I want you to think about what sort of reactions do you have physically, emotionally, intellectually, when you think about presenting. Yes?
I don't think it's supposed to have a slash before the 141.
Does it not work?
If you take a slash out, it works.
Okay, take out the slash. Sorry. So when you think about bringing design work, whatever it is that you have created, to class to get feedback from your professors.
Sorry, it says that we're on it, it's just there's not one active right now.
This is why we do these things,
All
right?
right, now it should be active.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Quiet now.
No, thank you. It's good feedback. All right, so just think about, like, what are your responses? What goes on in your head, in your stomach, in your heart? I don't know. What are your reactions as you're thinking about getting feedback from teachers or peers on the work that you've done? So Jason and I did a case study. We studied multiple classes at BYU that include design studios. Some of them are historically typical design studios, and some of them are kind of bringing design and studio design thinking into like a new area. In this case, we studied a business class that was using a studio model for startups. So since this is a case study, I want to give you a little bit of context with what the classroom looked like for the students. So one big room, somewhat like this. So teacher with groups of students sitting around at a table. In another area, there's another professor standing at a whiteboard talking to a student. They're working through problems. In this particular case, there was like 6 groups of people talking all at once, multiple whiteboards all over, just lots of things going on at once. Small group discussions, one-on-one discussions, students teaching students, instructors sort of responding to questions. It was just a huge mix of things that happened at once. So the student that we focused our research on was a female, and we called her Sasha. And some of the things she described herself as is a really driven student. She's really competitive. She's very much a perfectionist, and she really thrives on pressure, which to me sounds like a perfect mix for someone trying to make it in the startup entrepreneurial world. But this was her first experience with any sort of studio setting. The methods that we used for this were we recorded 3 interviews with her and her professor, but I focused only on the information that she gave. In her 3 interviews, we talked about feedback, the critique cycle, and what her experience was receiving feedback and participating in these discussions in the classroom. So then we coded them and found the relevant themes that sort of stood out from what she talked about. Some of the things, the most important things that we found that she experienced was, one was an attitude change. She learned to value really greatly rather than resent or fear getting feedback, as this was her first experience. In the past, she said that she had been a a perfectionist who didn't really like getting feedback, especially if it was negative or told her that she had done something wrong. And so she would reject that sort of feedback as like invalid. But now, with the change, she looked at feedback more as a way to help her grow rather than something that was like condemning. So I'm gonna show some of the quotes that she gave in her in our interviews. I invite you to read them. I'm not gonna read them out loud to you, but those are some nice. So you can get some context of how she was feeling and what she was thinking. So she learned to value it, which was a change that happened over many years, and I think not just the one course, but she could see a clear difference. In the studio setting, there were different types of feedback that she received, which helped her in different sorts of ways. So informal group feedback would be like sitting in a group around a table with her professor. They get to have long discussions, ask questions, and it's a very close and sort of like personal opportunity to talk about things in depth. And one of the things that she mentioned was that whatever you might bring to that discussion initially, usually expanded throughout the discussion. You might go into things that you weren't expecting, or you might get suggestions from the professor that you weren't anticipating. So it was a very active thing. So informal feedback, which would be like a pitch in front of the entire class and all of the professors, she called that competitive public criticism. Because it was so formal and so visible to everyone else, it came with more pressure. One of the drawbacks that she saw from that sort of type of feedback is because all members of the class had to do their presentations, time was usually pretty limited, and so they couldn't get the depth of feedback that they wanted. The professors might ask questions, but they couldn't necessarily clarify with them what they meant or where they should go from there. She also learned that there were opportunities in getting feedback from many, many different sources. She had six or more professors in the classroom that could give her support and feedback, but by the end, they were also going out to trade shows to pitch their ideas and get feedback from people who weren't really connected to them, or they weren't invested really in their success. So what she found is that getting feedback from so many different sources, you're going to get conflicting feedback at some point, but that's not really a problem. And in fact, it's something that you need to learn how to deal with. People are going to have different opinions. People may even tell you things that are wrong. But you need to build up the ability to judge and make decisions, like weighing the feedback, what's relevant, what's helpful, what's not, and then making decisions rather than relying completely on other people. The second major theme that emerged was the value that she placed on the relationships that she formed with her professors. So in this course, the professors intentionally built strong relationships. They met together. They all went out to lunch or dinner together to sort of like, do team bonding. And because she had that foundation of trust and feeling valued from her professors, when they did get into some of the more intense feedback, she knew that they were invested in her. And even though it was intense, or it might have been critical or negative sorts of feedback, she didn't take it as them being harsh. It was just, these are the things that I need to do to grow. So there were also some obstacles that came with having a close relationship with a professor. One of them was the closer they were, some of the students felt like they had an obligation to their teacher. So in this class, they're building some sort of business concept, and some of the students in your group felt more obligated to listen to the professor, take all of his ideas, or try to solve his problems rather than focusing on their major customer base. And also, she felt like instructors were sometimes not as straightforward as they could be because they're worried about protecting the feelings of the students, not making this a bad experience for them, and not crushing their dreams. So some of the takeaways that we got were, one, the studio is a place where you can form really strong and important relationships. Especially for people going into professional field, it's a place to find mentors, and those are really valuable. Second, your attitude about feedback can change over time. So however you feel about it now, it can grow and become more healthy as you get experience with it. And the last thing was some suggestion that she had for students in that mentoring is really a two-way relationship, mentoring and critiquing. And so it's part of your responsibility as students to ask for feedback if you're not getting what you want, to take the initiative and be proactive about that. So just curious. All right. Okay. So I see nervous, excited, confident, passion, apprehension, anxiety, unprepared, scary, frustrating, great, if I hide my design, I don't know, terror, hesitation. Okay, so we've got a lot of balance, well, some balance. A lot of people come in with the same types of sort of fearful feelings, I totally get it. But with her suggestion from her experience, I think that over time, you should have confidence that you can grow into a design person, a designer who appreciates and sees the value in feedback as well. The end.
Hey, a few minutes for feedback for Esther. And use your mic, if there's a microphone by you.
Easy, go ahead.
So, could you give advice as to what kinds of things teachers and students can do to engender those positive responses to feedback?
From her experience, it seemed like that initial relationship building was really important for her early on, knowing that she was cared for and that they were invested in her. I don't know that I could suggest like specific teaching strategies other than in your own class, figuring out ways to make the students know that they are valued and that you're invested. And that looked pretty different across the different studios that we studied. But for her, the biggest thing was that initial meeting. Other questions, Karen?
Was her experience typical of other students?
I think she was somewhat unique, mainly because some of the students we interviewed were design students, so they had a lot of experience with studio, and this was her first. I think she also sort of stands out as like that hyper-driven, high-pressure, overachiever sort of person, which I think we can all sort of relate to a little bit, maybe. So that's actually something that I would really be interested in studying more, like how typical is this, like other students in her group, do they have the same experience? Was her experience different because she was a woman in a mostly male setting, or does that not matter at all? Or what does it look like for students who have a bad experience? Because not everyone comes out of a design studio feeling great about getting feedback. So I feel like there's quite a variety. But with the case study, we're just trying to look at what her experience was. Maku?
super fast question. When you present this, are you planning on using that survey question at the beginning as well, or is that just for us?
I don't know.
Okay.
What do you think? I don't like standing and talking like with like zero interaction, so I would rather do something, but I don't know that that's like the best way.
So personally, I think it's a good question, and I know that today we were pretty strapped for time. But I think perhaps when you present it, if you have a little bit more time, give people maybe a little bit more of a buffer to answer the question. Just because I missed kind of your first slide, so that's what I'm thinking about an answer. But it was still a good presentation. Yeah. More time.
Matt?
Did she make or like have any specific things that she attributed the significant attitude change with? Was it like over time, were there specific things that just kind of participating in the design process made that happen?
From the questions that we asked her and then what she gave, it seemed like it was sort of a gradual process, and that not just happened in like the 2 months that she was in that studio, but had started like earlier through her college career. So very much an overtime sort of gradual process. Peter?
Along with Maku's point, at the beginning is a great time. A presentation is a performance. So it's a good time to establish your presence as a presenter. And so I think it's a great question to start off with. It's a great way to get the audience right away. But I would actually even start with the question that you sort of asked, because I think you actually even said sort of. Has anybody kind of done this? I would start with the question, how many people in here have ever participated in a studio environment? Right? So that's the first way of getting them to participate. And then with this, have people then answer the question, maybe put a QR code up there or something so people can quickly scan it. It takes a little while sometimes to enter in the URL.
Especially if it's wrong.
Especially, I would leave the URL as well. I'm just saying give them another way to, so I wouldn't get rid of the URL. I would make sure it's right, but also, give people a quick way so that they can spend a little more time answering things. So, and I think that's a great way to open, to get people's interest. So, and Charles is going to talk about closing.
Well, actually, mine had to do with the entrance too, and just, it might have been because I was distracted by trying to put the URL into it at the beginning. But I think one really important thing at the beginning is to get the so what out on the table in terms of like, why is this question, this inquiry that we're doing important to you? How do you connect to this inquiry? Because if you can do that, they'll stay with you the whole presentation. And it may have been that I was just a little distracted at the beginning, but I feel like really figuring out how you're going to connect.
With their so what or my so what?
Well, your so what has to connect with what they care about too.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they're going to just, why am I here in this presentation?
Is that like more like, why are you even here?
So there's 3 presentations typically that will happen in a session, or 2 or 3 depending on the length of your presentation. And they may not be there for yours, right? But they may end up staying because they're like, oh, this is interesting, right? I came for my friend's presentation, or I came because of the title, but they're kind of reading the abstract. So within the first couple of minutes, if they're like, this isn't the paper I expected, then they'll get up and go to another one that they're interested in. So I think that's what Charles is saying, is make sure that you connect with the people in the room, make it clear in your abstract, your presentation, why they should care.
So one way of thinking about this is if they're faculty, if you know that it's faculty in the audience, their interest might be that they're going to be teaching a studio course, right? And they want to know what the experience of their students are. If it's students in the room, how would you connect to them differently? Like, what would be their interest in this? So.
Okay. And do you is that like hand raising or other sort of polls? Like, how do you collect that sort of information?
Sure. How many in this class? How many in this presentation have taught a studio class? How many are faculty? Have you had? What has your studio experience been like? you know, or something that you could do very quickly that gives you a pulse for what their interests are in the room and how you might connect to those.
Great. Thank you.
I can just.
If anyone also has tips on how not to go red in the face.
Lots of I think the red in the face is good. The red in the face is good, red in the brain, you know.
That's color.
Green, really neat.
Okay, this is,
When you're ready.
So this project we're going to present to you today is about what has happened over the last 20 years in K-12 online learning articles, the trends that we see within articles that have been written. I was involved in this article first because I was taking my foundations class, and one of the projects we could do would be to write an article and collaborate with somebody outside of BYU, which was something I wanted to do. I like writing, I like research, and I wanted to collaborate since I had so much of that, and it seemed like a natural fit to me. However, as we went along and researched and compiled our findings from the research, it soon became to mean a lot more to me. I had been away from school for a long time, and looking at what had happened in K-12 education over 20 years was very interesting, especially as it had to deal with online types of K-12 classes. Because, how many of you know what that is? Raise your hand if you know what that is. All right, that really tells me a lot. This is a mimeograph machine. When I started teaching school, taught 8th grade language arts and reading, if you wanted to print something for your students, you typed it on this piece of paper that had a purple backing. Then you hooked it around this, and you just went like this. And the paper sped through, and when it got done, it looked like that color. That's what you gave your students. It was kind of blurry. So to come from that kind of background and come into a program that's all of a sudden talking about AIs and VRs, which took me a couple weeks to figure out, that was a huge thing to be able to see what had been happening for years and years in online learning, because I really loved online learning. So this is the process we went through. We searched sources to find out. We ended up with 350 articles over the time period of it was about 22 years. So Michael Barber got all the articles together, and he started out with things like the Handbook of K-12, Online and Blended Learning, anything that, any kind of handbooks that had to do with K-12 learning and online. He searched those references, and then he went to Google Scholar to look at the authors and other references that were in those books. He contacted 44 scholars to suggest articles we might have overlooked, just to see if, in a massive list that he collected, that if there were any more that they were aware of. And we found 356 articles, and an outside scholar verified the process and the results. We asked someone to check it over, make sure we hadn't missed some source that we should have been looking at. And like I said, we ended up with 356 articles, about 5 or 6 were duplicates, so it's around 351. In all those articles, we had 384 distinct authors. So obviously, they're being written by more than one person. The top 11 authors in K-12 learning, this is interesting to me because I wanted to know who was involved, who I could look to as far as finding out more about the field. So Michael Barber had 57 articles. He was by far, he's a publication machine. And then Kathy Kavanaugh, and you can just see down Ken Stevens, Charles Graham, Jared Borup, Jared, yes. Leanna Archambault, Jared and Leanna published JOLR, and their little baby. And so it's fun to be able to recognize the names and to see who's been the leads in that. 276 of the authors, so we had 384, 276 of them published only one article. So more than half the articles of these articles of the 276 were published from 2011 to 2016, which we wondered if that meant that there were more scholars becoming involved in K-12 learning, or perhaps professors were mentoring more graduate students and having them write with them. It was just a whole bunch of new authors who were just beginning their publishing careers. We also found that from 1999 when we began, we only had 2 authors at the beginning. At the end here, we're up to 7. And you can see where they come in. They're right there from 1999. 2002, the 3rd author comes in. 2005, the 4th. And just after that, 2006, the 6th and 7th. And they're all going on an upward trend. So there's more collaboration going on as well, which I think is a great thing, because too often in K-12, you just get stuck in your classroom and you don't collaborate. So have people coming outside and collaborating with them is really important. All right, we also looked at which journals were most published in. This is the top journal, JOLR, which Deanna Archibald and Jared Bork do. And they had only 7% of the total articles. In the top journal, but only 7% of them published in the same journal. There were 132 journals that published 4 or fewer articles, and 102 of the 350 that published only 1 article. What does that mean to you? What does that imply?
Community is very dispersed.
Mm-hmm. It's all over the place. So if you were writing a K-12 article, where would you go to publish? How would you know?
You wouldn't.
Hopefully you got the professor backing you up, right? I think that's one of the most interesting things about K-12 is that it's kind of all over the place. And if you are a scholar interested in K-12 learning, you'd have to become familiar with the kinds of journals that were targeting the kinds of research that you wanted to do. Most of those were not subject matter journals, so they weren't something like the National Council of Teachers of English or Math or something. They were journals that had to do with online learning. So I think there's even more to that number of journals that you can publish in. But I think as a K-12 scholar, you have a wide field that you would have to want to navigate. This has to do with the number of citations. In our research, we found that the article that had the most citations had 486 of them. And if you look at other areas, sometimes you're looking at thousands or tens of thousands of citations. So in K-12, we don't have a high amount of citations. Why do you think that would be? Kubaku.
No, is it just because by the nature of it being K-12, there are less researchers working in the field?
I think that's one question. I don't know the answer, but I think that's one question you could ask, is how many researchers compared to other fields? Charles?
It's also a relatively young field, I think.
And if you look at my mimeograph, it wasn't happening when I started teaching school, right? The online part of that, yeah. So it is relatively new. And also it is so, as I said, so spread out. There's so many places you can publish that if that was a really targeted article to a very small population of teachers or academics, you wouldn't have as many. So the top 20 come from 486 down to 107. And one thing that I'm going to stop in the middle, by the way, because that's longer than the 10 minutes. I'll explain now. One thing that Charles pointed out in another presentation of this is that this information doesn't tell you how many citations per year. So if this is the newest article, and it has 107, and that's the oldest, and it's 486, they're not necessarily that way. But if that were the case, this one may someday catch up. Does that make sense? So it's not necessarily the absolute number that they've received citations. The top articles are by Kathy Kavanaugh and Leanna Archibald and Laura Kripnitz and Michael Barber and his friend Reed. Look at these. Look at the titles of them. And what do you see? What do you notice about them?
They're lit reviews or meta-analysis?
Yeah. if you have a meta-analysis and you have a lit review, this is something different. But those two, why would they be so highly cited? The reviews and meta-analyses. With who?
Well, both of them tend to be a combination of a bunch of research into one. I mean, a meta-analysis is looking at what everything else found. The literature review is kind of a one-stop shop for learning everything you need to know about the topic. So,
So,
quick and easy way to get what you're looking for.
okay, so it's a good place to start research, right? And because it is such a diverse field, you might be able to find a lot of different ways to get started on it. Yeah, you just skip that one. All right. Skip that one. Okay. So like the highway back up. I just lost the conclusion, so sorry.
Should be able to just hit the back button. It's okay, we can show you later.
Yeah, okay, sounds good. Anyway, so the conclusions are is that it's a young field, it's a wide field, and there's still lots and lots of research to be done in K-12 online learning. So if you're all interested, just try it out.
Questions and feedback for Karen?
And actually, we'll be doing the three of us will be presenting. Cecil and Josh and I will all be doing the real presentation.
So I like that you have a lot of graphs. I thought, before your first graph, the page before where you were listing the number of publications.
The process of picking articles.
You had a page that was just information. It was right before your first graph, and it actually included like the top authors in the field.
Oh, yes.
And I thought that could make a graphic.
Okay.
The graphs, the colors on some of them were like a green on a gray background. Wasn't the easiest to see.
Okay.
Yeah, that was my main point there.
And that's a really good one for me because I don't see those things very easily. Anything visual, I would love to because I'm not good at that.
Karen, can you hold your microphone?
Oh, sorry. I forgot about that. Peter, Charles, Sean, whichever one wants to go first.
So obviously, the subject matter, I've got one of the 10 people over here, so we were talking about it, so that always helps. I would probably lead out with your second slide and then go to your title slide. I thought that was when you drew in the audience right there.
Okay.
You start off with the mimeograph, you're like, how many people know what this is, right? So that immediately, instead of standing up there saying, this presentation is about, and then reading the title.
Okay.
Start with that, and then lead into your title and say, so how have things changed over the past 20 years, right? That's the question that we're looking at. Although I don't know that that is necessarily what was answered in the presentation.
Yeah, that's
It's
true.
more of who are the main influencers, rather than what has the research looked at in the past 20 years. I don't feel like kind of a bait and switch that way. I didn't get what you were kind of leading us into thinking we were going to get.
Okay, that's really good. We're going to try a different way of starting it.
Go ahead, Cecil, you were gonna ask.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I don't think the research does answer that question. I don't think it's what has changed. I think it's just what has been going on and where has it been happening. Because looking at the changes, I mean, what's changed in the last 20 years? The field has been created, right? Like research has been done, that's the change. So then what has been done, where is it being done, who is doing it? I think those are really the questions.
From what was presented here, the what isn't answered. It's who. It's who and where.
And I think that's
But
a
I
really
don't know
valid
what
question.
those people are doing. I don't know the difference between Michael Barber and Charles Graham.
It's the
from
second half.
So,
It's
oh,
the second half of the presentation where we get into,
You do it.
are these theoretical, are they qualitative, are they quantitative? How many authors are on them? What is the trend? Are we seeing more or less theoretical pieces? Are we seeing more or less literature review pieces? So the what just comes after.
just didn't make it. Okay.
Although to me, what I would really like to know is what are the subjects? Not just what kind of article, but what are the subjects of those articles? Because that would be meaningful to me just to see what is happening on online learning. Not just that it is happening, but we're getting more research oriented instead of theoretical oriented. I would like to know what they're looking at.
Did you do a thematic analysis of the?
We did a word analysis of the abstracts, So we have the top 2-letter words, or I mean 2-word phrases, the top 3-word phrases. That still isn't quite what I would like to know. I mean, basically it says that they all say online learning, you know? So it doesn't really get to what I was curious about.
I just had a quick comment, just piggybacking off of Peter's comment as well. At the beginning, I was like, I mean, it was all really insightful, and I was like, wow, really? And I was like, I wanted to look into this journal and like that, and it was very resourceful. And but maybe just because it's my first semester, but at the beginning, I was kind of expecting, oh, like this is my research question, this is like my hypothesis, and this and that. So maybe just kind of like clarifying, like this presentation is like historical review of what's been happening. That's I'm going to review the authors and these specific themes, journals. I don't know, something like that. But it's kind of like a thesis
Sean,
presentation.
You had something to say.
Yeah, mine was already said. It was
Okay.
basically just, I really liked your second slide, and I think that if you started with that, it'd be more dynamic and fun, and then you could lead into your first slide, third slide, and so.
Okay.
So, it was said more eloquently.
All right, I think my friend is.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, time for the speed round. So this is research that was done in the 510 prereq writing class that we have to do. This was me and Cecil and Royce, there he is, and Kyle, who's no longer here. If you don't know him, he's awesome. So we looked, wait, it should be, why is it not up there? Well, that's, huh?
Got your name in the right corner.
Yeah, realistically, let's stop presenting, and let's present. Okay, cool. Let's go away. So yes, we looked at teacher use on Twitter for K-12 teachers, and essentially what we were wondering is, do they tend to use Twitter more for professional reasons, personal reasons, a bit of both, and how does it differentiate between the two? Like, what are they doing personally, what are they doing professionally? So two things that are important to know about beforehand is the idea of identity fragmentation and context collapse. So identity fragmentation is just kind of the general thing that happens, how we tend to act differently around different groups of people. Maybe when you're around your mom, you'll say and do different things than when you're around your group of friends from work. The way that I like to think about it is, maybe you see a meme or something online that's really funny and you want to share it, but it might have a swear word in it, so you don't share it because you don't want your mom to see it or something like that. And then, so that's identity fragmentation. Context collapse is what happens largely on social media because your audience is everyone. You're having to kind of present a more generic for everyone version of yourself. You're not sharing that meme or that funny joke because there are people who are in your social media circle who you wouldn't want to see it, even though you have a smaller group who might find it funny, or something else like that. Or maybe you don't want to get in a political debate with your uncle, so you don't share the political article on Facebook because he would see it and say something. So yeah, that goes back to the question. Also, another reason this is important is a lot of states have actual laws dictating how K-12 teachers can use social media. And part of the reason this research is important is it lets us see if teachers are already maybe self-regulating and maybe some of those laws are unnecessary or unnecessarily strict, things like that. So what we did is we analyzed a whole bunch of tweets from a whole bunch of teachers, so over 33,000 teachers to be specific, nearly 16 million tweets, so we had a really big sample size. And we were looking at specific things for the actual Twitter accounts, like their gender, political affiliation, but also like the content of their tweets, what were they tweeting about, what sources were they tweeting from, etc. We used some stats to analyze it. So some things that we found. Women are more likely than men to self-identify by their family role, wife, husband, mother, father, sister, brother, whatever. They're more likely to point that out on Twitter. So three big things in general that we looked at were family affiliation, religion and political persuasion. So you can see people were most open about family. They were quite a bit less open about religion, and they were very not open, very closed. I don't know. They didn't talk a lot about politics. But one thing that's interesting is it did tend to divide a little bit based off of where they were, city versus suburb versus town versus rural. So like people who are in more less populated areas, towns or rural, are a little bit more open about their family. That could be because people who work in those areas might be more likely to have a family than people working in the other areas, or it could just because they're more open. That's one thing that we need more research to identify. Likewise too for religion, people in less populated areas were more open about their religion than if they were in more populated areas. Again, that could be because people in less populated areas might be more religious, or just because they're more open about it. It's a thing that takes more research to find out. Politics as well. So a couple other things. Teachers were slightly more likely to lean left politically, but there are divides. You can see some of those summarized here. So like in every instance, teachers were slightly more likely to be left-leaning, but those gaps are bigger in some places than in others. So like for example, in cities, they were far more likely to be left-leaning, whereas like in rural areas, they were just slightly more likely. Yeah, and like as you saw in that last graph too, they're often way more open about their family than they were about religion or politics. This is just some of the sources they shared from. We don't really have a whole lot of time to talk about it, but you can see some of the top places they would share when they would share things were things like YouTube, Google, Instagram, Facebook, WordPress, New York Times. So it's not until you get to, I don't know, I'm not counting, but like the 10th-ish one that they actually shared something that was very education specific. No, it's not to say that they weren't sharing education specific things from YouTube or WordPress or New York Times or whatever, but they were sharing them from sources that were more general audience friendly. So even if it was education related, it was from something that was education related but intended for a general audience. And these are just some of the top hashtags. You'll notice a lot of those are education related though. Just to clarify too, user percentage is how many users actually shared something from that source, and then how many tweets had that. So 47% of users shared from YouTube at least once, but only 1% of their actual tweets were from YouTube. Same thing here. So 33% used the hashtag EdChat at least once, but only 1% of tweets had it. So as we pointed out, they're more likely to talk about their families than they were to talk about religion or politics. So this seems to indicate that they tend to separate their political self and their religious self from their Twitter self. They tend to kind of compartmentalize that and not be open about that on Twitter. So this might indicate, as we talked about before, context collapse. They are worried about their political or religious views colliding with potentially some of the views of their audience on Twitter. We do, like I said, however, need to have additional research to see whether that is just a common trend on Twitter. Maybe people in general on Twitter are less open about religion and politics, or maybe that's a teacher-specific thing. But regardless, it does seem that they do, when it comes to personal versus professional things, they tend to be a little bit more personal with things like family life, but they tend to not share more personal things like politics or religion, largely because we're assuming they think it might affect their professional life. So, yeah, that's it. Questions? Go for it.
So you had the graph with they share stuff about their family, about religion, about politics, not very much about politics. But you say you're talking about professional versus personal. So where's the professional? I know you mentioned like the sources, but other than that, how often were they actually talking about professional things? Do you?
I think Cecil, who also
So
helped
all
with
of
this
the
comment.
users that were involved in the study were Twitter users who self-identify as teachers. So it means in their profile they have said, I am a teacher, and so because they've done that, that's what we're saying is that personal professional divide. We assume that as people they probably have political beliefs and probably have some level of religious beliefs, but because we're not seeing those, whereas we are seeing family, we assume they also have familial relations. Because we're seeing that things aren't shared equally, that's where we're saying there's probably that personal professional divide that is happening there. Is that they're saying, you know, I'm a professional on Twitter, and as a professional, this isn't something that I'm going to share or talk about. This isn't something that's a part of my professional identity.
Is there another? Yeah.
One thought I had at the beginning, in particular, you were saying something, there was a lot of text on it, so I was trying to read that, and then you skipped, so I didn't get either sort of what you said or what was read. So maybe just sort of aligning what you're saying, what's on the text, and sort of like if there's a long list of bullet points, like having them reveal one by one is helpful, just to sort of align, like I'm either listening to you or I'm reading this thing, kind of making sure that's sort of.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that makes sense.
I really like this context slide. I'll use that. Thanks. I like the context slide and the 4 things that you talked about. So I thought that was really cool, and it made me understand why you would do this, besides that it's Twitter and kind of interesting in and of itself. I think it might be cool or helpful at the end of it to tie it back to this context and say, how could this affect these, especially the one too.
Thank you.
I have one question about it. So my question is, how did you determine what was left-leaning and what was right-leaning?
That's a question for Royce.
So Twitter's really interesting. They're changing their terms of use all the time. For this study, we did it just based upon keywords in their profile description. So if they self-identified as a Democrat or a Republican, or as some like a socialist or capitalist or something like that, you could get at that by analyzing content of the tweets themselves, but that actually violates Twitter's terms of use now. They've become very sensitive to using their platform as a way for inferring things about people, like mental health, which you can do. But so it violates Twitter's terms of use to use the tweets themselves to kind of infer someone's political stance, but if they're self-identifying in their biography, then it's happening.
Thank you.
Well, I was just going to say something that related to a couple of the questions, and that is just maybe up front. So go to the next slide.
Which one?
Just, yeah, help people understand a little better, like, the methods that you're using. So, like, obviously, you use some kind of algorithm or some kind of process to analyze the tweets. And I think I had lots of questions about that too. Like, how did you determine that the political leanings were the Twitter accounts that you were using? Were they professional accounts, or were they, personal accounts? How did you identify if the people were actually teachers?
Dr. Simmons has a magical spell tone.
Yeah, I was going to say, to be totally honest, the presentation at AECT is probably going to be between the 3 of us, but I was assigned to do this one by myself, and me and Cecil pretty much only did the everything but the analysis and the results. So we did the discussion and the intro, so everything about the analysis, that's all. I honestly don't know.
Well, I'm sure you'll do that. It's just that people will have questions about that and want to know about that. If you talk about that up front, then they won't, like...
We used to assume they'd have less questions when they walked in and Royce was wearing his sorcerer's cap and robe.
Yeah.
One thing also, in addition to this slide, I was wondering the whole time is, you had rural, it was great that you had rural and urban and the different areas, but I wondered, actually on that slide that you were at.
The one, this one?
How many of those 33,000, how many states were represented by those 33,000? Was it just those?
I think it was all 50, wasn't it?
All 50.
It should be all.
Yeah.
I assumed
I
it
don't know the
was,
exact
but I
numbers.
wasn't sure.
Like, I don't know if it's possible we didn't get one from Rhode Island, but it was a representative sample, so.
Okay. Just stuff like that, just, again, satisfying some of the types of questions. Can you go to the next slide really quickly? Okay, the next slide. Next slide. That one.
Okay.
Are those correct? Those percentages, it's 0.4%?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
It was confusing as he was saying it, that you were saying, oh, there's slightly more in it. I was like, oh, there's just over half. Oh, wait a second, that's
Right.
half of 1%, so.
Yeah, people were very, very reluctant to share political leanings, so that's why these are very small.
So that's the percentage of tweets.
No, that's percentage of teachers, right? Of users.
But that's
So
just-
less than 1%
That-
identified
that's
their
just
religion
people
or their
who-
political.
But that's just people who in their profile put that they were Democrats or Republicans or socialists or whatever.
Yeah, liberal or
But they
conservative.
might have been talking about political things. That doesn't indicate if their speech was.
But that should probably be the intro to this slide then. You're saying, by the way, we're talking about less than 1% of the population of this whole study when we're talking about this slide.
Self-identify in their profile.
Yeah.
So
Right.
I don't want to interrupt your guys' conversation, but we are over time.
Good job.
So
Yeah,
eat
a lot of the concerns would have been
soup and
addressed by
talk
more
about
time.
this while you eat, please.
Talk to everything we say has to come through the same.
Thank you, Michaela.